At 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this afternoon, the White House released a statement announcing that President Trump had personally called Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to propose an immediate bilateral agreement that would resolve the current crisis between the two nations. According to the statement, Trump offered to suspend all tariffs on Canadian goods, reaffirm U.S. commitment to NORAD, and restore full intelligence sharing. In exchange, he wanted one thing: Canada would guarantee continued energy exports to the United States at current levels and current prices for the next 10 years with contractual penalties if Canada restricted exports or raised prices beyond standard market rates. The White House described this as a generous offer that would restore the partnership that has served both nations for generations. Trump was confident that Prime Minister Carney would recognize this as an opportunity to end the dispute and move forward. Less than 90 minutes later, at 4:23 p.m., Mark Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa, looked directly into the camera, and said 4 words: "The answer is no." What followed was not a diplomatic hedge or a conditional rejection with room for negotiation. It was a detailed, methodical, publicly delivered explanation of why Canada refused, structured not merely as a response to Trump's specific offer, but as a statement of principle that will govern Canadian foreign policy for years. Every word was calculated, every sentence was addressed, not only to Washington, but to every capital on earth that was watching. Canada just said no to the United States. And in doing so, Canada has fundamentally altered the architecture of North American power in ways that the White House did not anticipate, that energy markets immediately priced as credible, and that cannot be reversed by any subsequent American statement or counteroffer. To understand the full weight of what happened this afternoon, you have to understand what Trump actually proposed, because the specific terms of the offer reveal how completely Washington misread Canada's position going into this negotiation. The phone call took place at 1:15 p.m. Trump opened by telling Carney that the dispute had gone too far and that it was time to make a deal. He said he was prepared to give Canada everything it had been asking for: tariff removal, NORAD continuation, intelligence sharing restoration, a public statement respecting Canadian sovereignty. In exchange, Trump wanted what he called energy security guarantees, the specific numbers Canada would be required to export a minimum of 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per day, 2.7 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day, and 1,400 megawatts of electricity per hour to the United States. These figures match current export levels. Trump was not asking Canada to increase supply, only to contractually guarantee its continuation. Price caps would apply. Canadian energy exports could not exceed a 15% premium over prices charged to other buyers, and penalty clauses would enforce compliance. If Canada reduced exports below the guaranteed minimums or charge prices above the caps, it would face financial penalties of $500 million per month. Trump reportedly told Carney this was a win-win deal. Canada gets relief, the US gets security, both sides move forward. He framed it as a personal favor and urged immediate acceptance before political opposition in Washington made the offer impossible to sustain. Carney listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. Then he said he would consult his cabinet and parliament before responding. He would have an answer within 3 hours. The call ended. Carney immediately convened an emergency cabinet meeting that lasted 45 minutes. His assessment of Trump's offer, according to sources present, was precise and unambiguous. This is a trap. Accepting means signing away Canada's resource sovereignty, agreeing that the United States can dictate what Canada does with Canadian resources, and eliminating all leverage for the next decade. Trump or any successor could do whatever they wanted to Canada during that period, and Canada could not respond by adjusting energy policy because it would be contractually prohibited from doing so. Carney framed the choice in terms that went beyond this specific deal. Accepting means agreeing that Canada is a supplier state and the United States is the customer state. Accepting means subordinate status. And he did not enter politics to make Canada subordinate to anyone. At 4:23 p.m., he walked to the podium. Understanding Carney's rejection requires reading it not as a press conference statement, but as a legal and diplomatic document, one in which every sentence was designed to accomplish a specific institutional objective and to be understood as such by multiple audiences simultaneously. Carney opened by confirming the factual record. Trump had offered tariff removal, NORAD reaffirmation, and intelligence sharing restoration, and had asked Canada to sign a 10-year agreement guaranteeing energy exports at specified levels and capped prices. He confirmed the offer accurately and completely. Then he stated the answer. What followed was structured around three distinct arguments, each one addressing a different dimension of why the offer was unacceptable, and each one carrying implications that extend far beyond the bilateral dispute. The first argument was sovereign ownership. Canada's natural resources belong to Canadians. Decisions about how they are used, who they are sold to, and at what price are made by Canadian institutions based on Canadian interests, not based on agreements that contractually obligate Canada to serve another country's requirements. This argument is not merely a statement of preference. It is a constitutional and legal claim. Canadian natural resources fall under provincial jurisdiction in the Canadian constitutional framework. The federal government does not have the unilateral authority to bind provincial resource decisions through a bilateral agreement with a foreign power. Carney was telling Trump and telling every watching government that the offer asked Canada to commit something that Canada's own constitutional architecture does not permit any government to commit. The second argument was the elimination of future leverage. The proposed agreement would remove Canada's ability to respond to any future American action. If the United States imposed tariffs again, threatened Canadian sovereignty again, or violated agreements again, Canada could not adjust energy policy in response because the contract would prohibit it. This is the argument that Carney identified internally as the trap, a contractual arrangement that removes your ability to respond to the other party's future bad behavior, does not resolve a conflict. It institutionalizes your own defenselessness against future versions of the same conflict. It is not a peace agreement. It is a capitulation with a 10-year guarantee attached. The third argument was market competition and sovereign equality. Canada exports energy to many countries. Those decisions are made by Canadian companies and the Canadian government based on market conditions and strategic priorities. Canada will not subordinate those decisions to American demands. And then came the sentence that sent immediate shockwaves through energy markets. As of today, Canada has received purchase proposals from 11 countries on 4 continents. We are evaluating all of them. The United States is welcome to compete for Canadian energy on the same terms as everyone else. That final line, "the United States is welcome to compete," was the most consequential sentence delivered in North American diplomatic history in decades. It was not a threat. It was a market announcement. Carney was publicly informing the world that Canadian energy is now available for competitive purchase, that the era of assumed American preferential access is over, and that the United States has been placed on equal footing with China, Japan, South Korea, India, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. The White House had no prepared response. According to sources, senior officials genuinely believed Carney would accept. They had structured the offer to give Canada what it had been publicly demanding: tariff relief, sovereignty acknowledgement, alliance restoration, while securing American energy interests. When Carney rejected it publicly and immediately, the administration spent over an hour without producing a coherent statement. When Trump's response finally appeared on Truth Social at 5:30 p.m., it said Canada had made the biggest mistake in their history, that America does not need Canadian energy, and that Canada should try selling to China and see how that works. That post contradicts documented facts that any energy analyst can verify in minutes. 60% of American oil imports come from Canada. The reason is not simply price or proximity. It is refinery configuration. American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast were built specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. The particular chemical composition of oil extracted from Alberta's oil sands. Switching to alternative crude sources would require billions of dollars in refinery modification and years of engineering work. There is no short-term alternative to Canadian supply for the American refineries that depend on it. The president's claim that America does not need Canadian energy is not a negotiating position. It is a factual inaccuracy posted publicly by the head of state of the country, most dependent on the resource he claimed not to need. The markets read the situation with more accuracy than the Truth Social post. West Texas Intermediate crude futures jumped 7.2% within 15 minutes of Carney's statement. Natural gas futures for Midwest delivery spiked 14.3%. Shares of U.S. refineries that depend on Canadian crude collapsed. Valero Energy down 11%. Phillips 66 down 9%. Marathon Petroleum down 13%. The market was not reacting to a bluff. It was pricing in a credible and documented shift in the direction of Canadian energy exports. The question that every energy analyst and every geopolitical strategist is now working through is not whether Carney's rejection was genuine. The market reaction settled that within 15 minutes. The question is whether Canada can actually execute on what Carney announced, whether redirecting Canadian energy exports away from the United States is operationally feasible within a timeframe that makes it strategically relevant. The honest answer is that the existing infrastructure creates a constraint that is real but not permanent. The pipeline and transmission infrastructure that currently moves Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity was built over decades with a specific destination in mind: American markets to the south. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, the Keystone System, the Enbridge network, the natural gas lines crossing the northern border. These systems were designed, financed, and optimized for southward flow. Reversing or redirecting that flow is not technically impossible, but it is not simple and it is not fast. However, and this is the critical analytical point, Canada is not proposing to redirect existing infrastructure. Canada is proposing to build new infrastructure oriented toward Pacific and Atlantic export. The distinction matters enormously. New Pacific Coast terminals would allow Canadian crude and liquefied natural gas to be loaded onto tankers bound for Asian markets. New Atlantic terminals would serve European buyers who are currently dependent on Middle Eastern and Russian supply, with all the geopolitical risk those dependencies entail. These terminals do not compete with existing southward infrastructure. They supplement it, creating a parallel export pathway that gives Canadian producers a genuine market choice for the first time. The timeline for this infrastructure, according to energy sector analysts, is 18 to 24 months for initial capacity, if construction is prioritized and regulatory processes are expedited. Canada's Alternative Security Partnership Fund request to NATO includes specific funding allocated for exactly these projects. If that request is approved and the 235 vote that established the fund suggests the governance structure to approve it is in place, construction can begin within weeks of funding confirmation. The 11 countries that have submitted purchase proposals represent a buyer market for Canadian energy that did not exist 6 months ago. The specific countries Carney referenced include China, Japan, South Korea, and India among the Asian buyers, all of whom currently import energy from the Middle East or Russia at prices that Canadian supply could undercut, while offering superior geopolitical stability. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are evaluating Canadian LNG as a mechanism to reduce continued dependence on Russian natural gas, dependence that the European energy crisis of recent years exposed as a structural vulnerability. No European government wants to maintain indefinitely. The competitive dynamics of this bio-landscape give Canada something it has never previously possessed in its energy export relationship with the United States: genuine optionality. Optionality in commodity markets is not merely an economic concept. It is a source of institutional leverage that transforms the negotiating position of any seller. When you have one buyer, and that buyer knows it, the buyer sets the terms. When you have 11 documented buyers and the capacity to choose among them, you set the terms. Canada is in the process of converting its energy export relationship with the United States from a structural dependency in which American access was assumed and Canadian alternatives were theoretical into a competitive market relationship in which American access must be earned on terms acceptable to the seller. The American refinery sector's market response told this story more clearly than any diplomatic analysis. Phillips 66, Valero, and Marathon Petroleum are not abstract financial instruments. They are industrial facilities employing tens of thousands of workers in the American Midwest and Gulf Coast, processing specific grades of crude oil for which Canadian supply is not simply the most convenient source, but the source for which their equipment was engineered. 13% decline in Marathon Petroleum's share price within an hour of Carney's statement represents the market's assessment of what Canadian export diversification means for those facilities, not in the abstract future, but in the immediate operational present. Senator Lindsey Graham stated publicly that Canada will come crawling back when they realize they have no other options. The 11 documented purchase proposals, the NATO infrastructure funding mechanism, the 14% natural gas futures spike, and the 13% Marathon Petroleum decline collectively constitute the market's response to that assessment. Canada has options. The market has priced them, and the gap between Graham's statement and the documented evidence is the gap between political messaging and institutional reality. Step back from the specific terms of the rejected offer and the immediate market reaction, because what happened this afternoon in Ottawa is not simply a bilateral trade dispute reaching a significant inflection point. It is a demonstration of a principle about the nature of sovereign power in international relations, a principle whose implications extend far beyond Canada and the United States. The principle is this: leverage in international relations does not belong to the party with the larger military or the larger economy. It belongs to the party with the most credible alternatives. For decades, Canada's position in its relationship with the United States was structurally defined by the absence of credible alternatives. Canadian energy flowed south because the infrastructure flowed south, the refinery relationships were established southward, and the continental market was so deeply integrated that the concept of alternative buyers was theoretical rather than operational. Washington operated on the assumption, largely accurate for decades, that Canada would ultimately comply with American preferences because Canada had no viable path to doing otherwise. Carney's statement this afternoon was the public announcement that this structural condition has changed. The 11 purchase proposals are not hypothetical. The NATO Infrastructure Fund is not conceptual. The 23-5 vote that established it is a documented institutional fact. The pipeline terminal construction that can begin within weeks of funding confirmation is an engineering project, not a political position. Canada is not bluffing about alternatives, because Canada is not relying on alternatives that do not yet exist. It is announcing a process through which alternatives that are already being developed will become operational on a documented timeline. The three scenarios that now define where this relationship goes carry different implications for American consumers, American industry, and American strategic positioning. In the competitive bidding scenario, multiple countries submit formal long-term supply agreements over the next 60 days. Canada runs a documented competitive process. If the United States participates and matches terms, Canadian energy continues flowing south with a different contractual basis, one that reflects equality between sovereign partners rather than assumed American preferential access. This is the least disruptive scenario for American energy markets, but it requires Washington to accept a fundamental change in the structural terms of the relationship. Canada is no longer a captive supplier. It is a sovereign seller with documented buyers competing for its product. In the infrastructure race scenario, Canada uses NATO funding to accelerate Pacific and Atlantic terminal construction. American energy prices increase as the market prices in reduced Canadian supply over a 2-year construction horizon. U.S. dependence on Canadian energy is permanently reduced, not because Canada stops exporting, but because Canada's new infrastructure gives it the ability to export elsewhere, which changes the price and terms at which it exports to the United States. This scenario is economically painful for American consumers, but strategically stabilizing for Canada because it converts a structural dependency into a commercial relationship subject to normal market discipline. In the crisis escalation scenario, American domestic energy shortages from reduced Canadian supply trigger political consequences severe enough to force a full reversal of American negotiating position. The economic arithmetic of this scenario is straightforward. If Canada redirects 30% of current US-bound oil exports to Asian buyers, Midwest refineries face supply shortfalls they cannot quickly replace, and retail gasoline prices in key political states rise sharply enough create electoral consequences that override whatever domestic political benefit the confrontational posture was intended to generate. What Carney demonstrated this afternoon is that sovereignty is not an abstraction or a rhetorical position. It is a negotiating asset, one that can be leveraged or surrendered, one that has measurable market value, and one that once surrendered contractually is not recoverable for the duration of the contract. Trump's offer would have purchased the appearance of restored partnership at the cost of Canada's ability to exercise sovereign judgment about its own resources for a decade. Carney's calculation that sovereignty is worth more than the temporary relief its surrender would have purchased was not sentimental, it was strategic. The old relationship between Washington and Ottawa operated on a foundational assumption that America assumed and Canada complied. That assumption produced the offer Trump made this afternoon. It was a reasonable offer if the assumption was accurate. Carney's 4 words established that the assumption is no longer accurate. The United States is welcome to compete, not to demand, not to assume, to compete on equal terms with 11 other countries already in the queue. That is not a diplomatic statement. That is a structural redefinition of the relationship between the two countries. And unlike a tariff, which can be reversed by executive order, a structural redefinition backed by infrastructure, by institutional funding, and by documented buyer interest does not reverse when the political winds change. The answer was no, and the answer will remain no until Washington understands what it was actually being asked to earn.